All right. Now, I'd like to start, I always like to start by saying, you know, here are some views that I hold, and they're completely crazy, you know, or everybody else thinks they're completely crazy, and I'm going to try and persuade you that they're true. I'm now put in I've recently been put in a certain more difficult position, as I've recently discovered that there are some people that actually agree with me about some of this. So I got a very nice sort of Google citation alert yesterday afternoon, and I looked it up, and it was a link to something in Google Books, and I just got a little excerpt. It says, "Does this mean that Bill Wringe is right about the obligations of the global community?" Of course he is. But, and unfortunately, when I scrolled down to see what the but was, you know, it was one of these Google Books previews that sort of says, this page, unfortunately, is not included in the preview. So I don't know what the but is, but apparently some people now agree with me about some of my views about obligations, and in particular, something that I'm quite interested in, obligations that fall on groups that aren't agents, and in particular on one kind of non-agential group, namely the non-agential group that consists of everybody or all of us. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this paper is try and talk about some arguments for the existence of collective obligations that I think are not very good arguments. And I'm then going to say, well, yeah, although you might think these are not very good arguments, and you might not have a problem with that, this is a problem for me. And it's a problem because the criticism that I'm going to make of these arguments for collective obligations looks as though it might also be a problem for an argument for collective obligations that I've given. And I don't think it is. And part of the point of this paper is to try and explain why an argument that I've given in various places is not subject to the same kind of criticism. And it's going to turn on a difference, or what I take to be a difference, between forward-looking and backward-looking obligations. So I'm going to say there's a certain style of argument that really doesn't work very well when you're thinking about backward-looking obligations, but when you're thinking about forward-looking obligations, I think there are reasons to say that it is just fine. Okay, so let's just make that all a little bit more formal. I'm going to say that there's a significant distinction between forward-looking and backward-looking obligation. So is there a link to that? I've just sort of seen somebody say in the chat, is there a link to the handout? And I thought somebody had posted the handout to the chat.
It's been posted again by somebody.
Yeah, it's there now.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I'm going to rely quite heavily on the idea that there's a distinction between backward-looking claims about what individuals or groups are responsible for, yeah, things that, you know, we can hold them responsible for that they have done or failed to do, and claims about what groups or individuals are obliged to do in the future. So I'm predominantly interested in forward-looking obligations. I used to be able to say that that sort of distinguished me from a lot of other people in the literature. And it still does distinguish me from some other people in the literature, but more recently, there have been a bunch of people, Stephanie Collins is one of them, that have also tended to focus on forward-looking obligations. And I'll say a little bit more at the end of the paper about why I don't think it's as easy to move from claims about forward-looking obligation to claims about what we've done wrong in the past. Okay, so strong claim would be we should focus on the forward-looking rather than the backward-looking. I think that's true, but I'm not going to try and persuade you of that today. I am going to try and persuade you of a slightly weaker claim, namely there are important differences between arguments for forward-looking and backward-looking claims about collective obligation. Okay. As I say, in the past, I've argued for the possibility of forward-looking obligations falling on non-agential groups, and in particular, the global collective, the collective consisting of everybody. And one way in which I've argued for that is a kind of rights-based argument. So the argument really comes out of a response to a criticism that people have made about certain kinds of claims about rights. So what people have sometimes said in the past is, look, it's fine to say that people have, say, a right to liberty or a right to free speech or something like that, because that just means that if I've got a right to liberty, that just means everybody should refrain from interfering with certain ways in which I might act. If I've got a right to free speech, everybody should refrain from stopping me from expressing my opinions. But there's another class of rights or supposed rights that people have thought are more problematic. So if I say everybody's got a right to an adequate standard of living, or everybody's got a right to healthcare or subsistence or something like that, people often say, and when I say people, an example of somebody who said this is Honora O'Neill, said that's much more problematic, because if you say people have got a right to that, then that suggests that they can demand of people that they be provided with these things. And that's problematic because who exactly is it that's supposed to provide these things? So the idea is, for a right to make sense, it's got to be claimable. You've got to be able to identify particular individuals who need to do particular things in order for you to be able to exercise that right. In the case of rights to liberty, that's fine. You can impose that claim on everybody. In the claim of what are sometimes called, in the case of what are sometimes called subsistence rights, that's more problematic. We have to identify who the claim falls upon. And there might be nobody whom the claim could fall upon, right? So problem with subsistence rights then is it might be impossible to find any eligible agent on whom the demand that's correlative to the right, the demand that the right gives rise to, could possibly fall on. Okay. So what I've argued in response to that is that's fine. I agree that rights give rise to duties, but we can identify a duty bearer of last resort. We can identify as the duty bearer of last resort the group consisting of everybody. Okay. Now, there's a lot to be said about that I'm not going to say. People have often worried, well, we think that duties have to fall on agents, and the group consisting of everybody isn't an agent. So, how can there be a duty that falls on everybody collectively? I've written about and responded to and talked about that objection at quite great length in various places. And I don't want to say anything more about that today, except to say, yeah, I'm aware of that as an objection. I've written about it. I've addressed it elsewhere. Okay. Today, I want to talk about a different kind of objection to this sort of view. And I want to say, well, what I think is good about my view is that it can sidestep an objection to certain kinds of things. So that's me. Now I'm going to talk about some other people. I'm going to talk about 3 arguments that are in the literature for the existence of collective obligations. And I think that they all exemplify, or could be reasonably taken to exemplify, a common pattern. And I think there's something wrong with the common pattern that they seem to exemplify. And I also think that once we've identified the common pattern, you might think that the argument that I've just given is subject to, is also an instance of the same pattern, and that it's going to be problematic for the same reasons. So, start off with Philip Pettit. Philip Pettit's got a nice paper in 2006 about the Herald of Free Enterprise disaster, where he says, this is a case where it's nice to be able to attribute responsibility to a corporate body rather than any particular individuals, okay? Why? Because it might be that, once we've done with attributing responsibility to all the individuals who are involved and, involved and not excused, there might be a surplus of responsibility to go round that has to be attributed to something. So I hold that even when all the relevant enactors in group action have been identified and held responsible, still it may be important to hold the group agent responsible as well. The responsibility of enactors may leave a deficit in the accounting books, and the only way possible way to guard against this may be to allow for the corporate responsibility of the group in the name of which they act. Okay, so we've got some responsibility, we want to attach it to something, something's gone wrong, we want to attach responsibility to something. We've attached all the responsibility we can to individual members, and there's some left over, but fortunately, we can attach it to a corporate agent. Okay. Here's David Kopp with a more developed example of the same thing. Suppose that Bob, Carol, Ted, and Alice are members of the Board of Governors of the state prison. A month ago, the board voted against strengthening security procedures at the prison, and it's now being blamed for this decision in the light of bloodshed resulting from a recent attempted escape. It would be unreasonable to blame Carol, since she brought forward the motion to increase the funding, she argued for the motion, and she voted for it. Bob missed the meeting. He had a very good excuse. He was out of town dealing with a family emergency. Alice voted against the motion, but she had an excuse for doing so. She and Ted agree on most issues, and there are too many difficult issues that come before the board for both of them to do thorough research on every issue. They have a standing agreement to take turns doing the necessary research, and it was Ted's turn to do the research. Alice voted against the motion, seeing that Ted was also voting against it, and believing that Ted had done the research necessary to make a reasonable decision. Suppose we learn that Ted had an excuse. Suppose Ted has been under enormous stress because of serious illness in his family, and as a result, he has been unable to sleep. Given his exhaustion, he misremembered whose turn it was. He believed it was Alice's turn. When the time came to vote, he was confused as a result of his exhaustion, and he thought that Alice was signaling him to vote against the motion. In this case, it seems to me Ted is not blameworthy for voting against the motion. It also seems, however, that it would be a mistake to absolve the board from blame for the decision. I think the board is appropriately blamed, all things considered. So none of the board members can be blamed, but the board can be. Okay. And here is Sarah Chant. Now, the interesting case about this is for Kopp and Pettit, we're talking about attaching responsibility to to what is plausibly a collective agent. Sarah Chant thinks we can give a similar kind of argument, or what looks like a similar kind of argument, for attaching responsibility to a non-agential group. So here's an example that she calls the Hollywood standoff. Mr. Good, Mr. Bad, and Mr. Ugly find themselves in a Hollywood standoff. Each is holding a gun to the head of another member of the group, such that everyone in the group has a gun pointed to his head. Everyone knows that the first to shoot will surely be shot, and everyone believes that everyone knows this. Moreover, everyone believes that if anyone were to begin to lower his gun, chaos could ensue, and everyone could get shot. Additionally, nearby and within clear sight of the men, a child is suffering from severe dehydration. The men see that the child is in imminent danger and could easily be saved if they all lowered their guns and gave the boy the last few slips of water from each of their flasks. Nevertheless, Mr. Good, Mr. Bad, and Mr. Ugly uphold the standoff and the child dies. According to the case, the men together could have put down their guns and given the child the last few sips of water from each of their flasks. So even though each has an excuse that absolves him of responsibility, those excuses do not absolve them jointly. Thus, the Hollywood standoff is a prima facie example of non-distributive responsibility without a collective agent. Sounds like I should like that, right? Okay. So here's what seems like a common pattern in all of these arguments. Describe a situation in which it seems intuitively plausible that some or all of a group of individuals are responsible for a bad outcome. Step 2, argue that none of the individuals involved in that outcome can appropriately be held responsible for that outcome. Step 3, identify some further thing to which the individuals in step 1 are appropriately related, and argue that responsibility, which we find it intuitively plausible to assign, falls on this further entity. So in Herald, that's the company that was operating the ship. In Board, it's the board as a collective agent. And in Standoff, it's the non-agential group consisting of the 3 gunmen. Okay, so I think there's something wrong with this pattern of argument. And I think, yeah, it's easy to come up with arguments that fit this pattern that seem problematic. Okay, so suppose the sinking of the Herald of Free Enterprise had been caused not, as in reality, by someone having left the car deck doors open, but by a freakish and unpredictable natural event in which the waters of the Thames suddenly become strongly acidic and corroded the properly closed doors. Suppose that the Board of Governors votes electronically and that because of an electronic glitch, their vote to increase staffing levels is misrecorded. Or suppose that the death of the child in Hollywood Standoff is preempted by a rockfall caused not by the actions of Good, Bad, and Ugly, but by a freak gust of wind. So, in all of these cases, again, something bad has happened, but in these cases, it just seems clearly inappropriate to blame some further entity, the corporation, the board. Yeah. In these cases, not only is every individual excused, the group is excused as well. Okay. Now, Caroline Arruda has suggested in talking about the Hollywood Standoff example that what goes wrong here, or what goes wrong in the Hollywood Standoff, is that we've assigned blame not for actions, but for outcomes. So the child dying, that is not anybody's action, that is an outcome. Nobody's done that. And Arruda thinks that's a mistake in the Hollywood Standoff example. And you might think that's also what's happened in my 3 examples of bad arguments for collective responsibility. Okay. But I think that's wrong. Okay. I think that what's gone wrong in the 3-step argument is something different. Namely, it'd be inappropriate to assign responsibility in these cases because doing so presupposes that blame must attach somewhere. And there's no reason to think this is right. We can't start off by saying there's a fixed quantity of blame and we've got to attach it to something. That is just, a mythical way of thinking of things. It's as though you imagine blame as this sort of this stuff that you've got to spread around somewhere. And that seems obviously wrong in our three starred examples. So how to decide which of these explanations is right? Is it because we're talking about outcomes rather than actions, or is it because we've got this bad idea about blame? Well, let's look at some other examples. Suppose that in the Herald of Free Enterprise case, the failure to shut the doors of the ferry can be traced to a single individual who has an excuse at the moment the doors needed to be, at the moment when the doors needed to be shut, they were engaged in preventing some other unpredictable but imminent disaster. So it's not because there's something wrong in the corporate ethos, as people argued was the case in the actual Herald of Free Enterprise case. It's just one individual failed but had an excuse. Suppose the electronic voting machines have become miswired in such a way that the results of their vote was the reverse of what it should have been. Or suppose that the inaction of good, bad, and ugly in the Hollywood standoff is excused not by a threat, but by the fact that a sudden movement by any of them risks setting off an avalanche that will kill all four of those involved in the predicament. It seems to me we can't adopt a ruder strategy here, right? It seems to me that, here, when the bad outcome happens, there is a bad outcome, but the bad outcome, what we really think is that the bad outcome is or involves somebody's action. It's not just something that happens. It's something that happens as a result of action. Okay. But it still seems as though in each of these cases, it would be wrong to hold some non-individual responsible, okay? There's just as little reason to hold people responsible in these cases as there was in the starred cases. So that seems to me good reason for thinking that what's going wrong in the starred cases is that we think that there's a fixed amount of blame to assign. And when we realize that that's not the case, then we're not going to think that there's any kind of collective responsibility. But look, all of these arguments, all of these arguments, if they're bad arguments because they instantiate the quantum of plane error, they're examples of the three-step pattern, right? Right? So if that's right, there's something wrong with this form of argumentation. Okay. Right. So it seems to me, we've got good reason for thinking there's something wrong with what looks like the argument pattern in Herald, in Board, and in Standoff. Okay. Well, what about the rights-based argument that I gave right at the beginning of the paper? Does that fit the three-stage pattern as well? Well, look, you might think that it doesn't. And here's why. You might think that it doesn't because in each of the examples we looked at, what was happening was that, we started off with a situation where intuitively there was some blame to be distributed for a bad outcome. We couldn't assign it to any individuals, so we decided we had to assign it to something else. And what I've argued is, that's a mistake, right? It's a mistake to think that you can first of all identify that there's some blaming to be done and then say, okay, who are we going to attach this to? Now, take my forward-looking argument, my argument that says, well, look, if there is a right, there's got to be an obligation bearer, and if no other obligation bearer is eligible, the obligation falls on all of us collectively. Well, doesn't seem to be about blame, right? Okay. Okay. We're talking about, you know, what people need to do in order to prevent certain kinds of bad outcomes. Okay. But somebody might say, yeah, look, okay, there's a difference between, you know, blaming people for a bad outcome and trying to prevent some bad outcome happening in the future. But, you know, it seems as though in both cases, something very similar is going on. In the backward-looking cases, something bad has happened and should have been prevented, and we can't say individual that they should have prevented it, but maybe we can say of something else that they should have prevented it. Okay. It looks as though we're saying something fairly similar, right? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. There's this duty correlative to a right. There's something that's got to be done. We can't maybe assign any individual or even any group agent, yeah, the task of doing it. So we look around for something else. We look around and we find the community consisting of everybody, and we assign the responsibility to that group. Okay. So those arguments look as though they have something very obvious, or something pretty obvious in common. Okay, so it's not about blame, but it does seem to say, yeah, there's a specific bunch of stuff that needs to be done, and we've got to assign the blame, we've got to assign the responsibility to someone. Okay, so yeah, what I don't think I could do in this situation is just say, look, yeah, blame, it's backward looking, it works one way. Accountability, it's forward looking, it works a different way. So what would be fallacious when we think about blame is not fallacious when we think about, yeah, the distribution of forward-looking responsibilities. That just seems explanatory and unpersuasive. Okay. So here's an attempt to say, well, it is true that blame and accountability work in different ways, but I'm going to tell you why. Okay. So here's the thought. Assigning blame and assigning, yeah, forward-looking responsibility, assigning accountability, that's a word I'm going to use here for assigning forward-looking responsibility. Yeah, those are different kinds of practice. They have different kinds of goals. So you shouldn't expect that what's true of one is going to be true of the other. So what's about blame? Well, blame, I take it, is an expressive practice that has among its purposes those of establishing moral responsibility, morally educating its targets and those who are witness to its expression, and expressing solidarity with its victims. What are the functions of assigning forward-looking responsibility? Well, primarily not, you know, educating or expressing or the expression of solidarity. Assigning forward-looking responsibility without getting stuff done. Okay, so you know, if we say people have got a right to subsistence and this gives them a claim right, okay, then what we make sure that they get fed. Okay. Yeah. Or, if we've got a right to healthcare, yeah, ideally what we want is a situation where we know who it falls upon to provide them with healthcare. Okay. So I take it that, you know, both of our practices here are malleable, right? We can rethink how we assign blame. We can rethink how we assign accountability. But because blame and accountability are doing different kinds of jobs, the constraints on what is a good practice for assigning blame are going to be very different from the constraints on a good practice of assigning forward-looking responsibility. So in particular, when it comes to blame, we have the option of not blaming anybody at all. And that's, I take it, precisely what we should, that's precisely the option we should take in cases like Herald Star and Board Star and Standoff Star. And in these ones as well, in the double-starred examples. It's an open question, and I'm not making any claims about what our practice should be in the initial set of examples, right? Okay, I'm not saying, we shouldn't assign blame in those cases as well, right? Okay, I'm just saying, well, there's nothing that says that blame has to be assigned in those kinds of cases. If we want to assign blame in those cases, we need to give some kind of story about why that's a sensible thing to do. Right? And look, people have given stories, right? So take Pettit, right? Pettit gives a story about why we might want to assign blame in that kind of case. But what I think he can't do is say, well, obviously some blame has got to be assigned, right? Okay. So once you start talking about a gap in the accounting books, then it sounds as though you're going to say, there's some blame that's got to be assigned. If it doesn't fall on an individual, it's got to be assigned somewhere. But what about forward-looking responsibility? What about accountability? Right? Okay. Well, the constraints are different from the constraints that were on our practice of assigning blame. If there are bad outcomes to be avoided, we can't just say, well, we're not going to assign those costs anywhere at all. Right? If you don't blame anybody, nobody gets blamed. And the bad outcome has already happened. If you don't assign forward-looking responsibility, it doesn't mean that the costs of get avoided. Right? Instead, it means the costs fall on the people who would otherwise have had the right. So if you don't assign responsibility for meeting the subsistence need, it doesn't mean there's no cost to be. It means it's the people that have that need are the people that bear the cost. They end up starving. So there we have a very obvious reason why our practices of assigning forward-looking responsibility and our practices of assigning blame aren't going to be precise mirrors of one another. Okay, so there's an objection, okay? Obvious objection. And it's this. If what I'm saying is right, it seems to sever what seems like a very natural link between forward-looking and backward-looking responsibility. Okay. So here's something we want to say, I take it. If one has a forward-looking obligation to do something and one fails to do so, one is responsible for one's failure to do so. Okay. But if we accept this, and we also think that backwards-looking responsibility tracks appropriate blame, maybe we think that backward-looking responsibility just is appropriate blame, or maybe we think that appropriate blame ought to mirror backward-looking responsibility. I'm not sort of taking any stand on whether the blame or the responsibility is conceptually prior here. But what I am saying is, if we accept the natural view about how forward-looking and backward-looking obligation are related to one another, then it's very hard to see how there could be the kind of asymmetry that I'm pointing towards. Okay. So obviously what I'm going to say is we should reject the natural view. It's a natural view, but it's a mistake. Okay. So why is that not a simple thing to do? Why is the natural view so natural? Well, here's something that I think somebody could say in response, right? Okay. I think they could respond by saying, look, if you fail to carry out your forward-looking obligations, then that makes you liable to reparative costs, right? Okay. If there was something you were supposed to do and you failed to do it, then it's on you to do something about it. And look, blame or liability to blame just is a reparative cost. Yeah, okay. If you can't do anything else about it, what you should at least do is take on the burden of being the person that's blamed for what's gone wrong. Okay, so that's what I take might motivate the natural view. And I guess what I want to say is, no, being subject to blame, it's wrong to think of being subject to blame as a reparative cost in that way. Or at least it's wrong to think of it as being a fixed reparative cost, okay? To think that, there's a cost there, a reparative cost that has to be paid in the form of blame, just is to be subject to the idea that there's a fixed amount of blame that has to be distributed somehow. And that just is the quantum of blame error. Okay, so that's what I think we should say about the natural view. Okay, that's not the only way out, right? We could say backward-looking responsibility just comes apart from appropriate blameworthiness. I could say that, but I'm going to avoid saying that because I just think that's the easy way out, right? It commits me to a view about backward-looking responsibility that's controversial, right? So I want to say, let's suppose that backward-looking obligation does track appropriate blameability. We should reject the natural view. It's based on the quantum of blame error. But I think maybe I can do a little bit better than that. So I want to persuade you on independent grounds that the natural view is wrong. So here's an argument. Okay. Consider not the relationship between blame and backward-looking obligation, but the relationship between encouragement and forward-looking obligation. So here's the thing that you might be tempted to think if you were tempted to think that blame tracked backward-looking obligation. X has a forward-looking obligation to phi if and only if it would be appropriate to exhort X to phi, to encourage X to phi. Yeah. Okay. All right. So seems to me that if you think that blame tracks backward-looking obligation, then you should think that appropriate exhortability tracks forward-looking obligation. And now what I want to say is, suppose you accept the natural view, right? Then you're going to say it's appropriate to blame X for failing to phi if they failed to phi, and it was appropriate to exhort them to phi. Okay. But seems to me that that's just false. So here's an example that anybody who has worked with me is probably going to feel is particularly poignant. Suppose I promised my co-author that every day for a week, I will start my working day by working for an hour on my draft of a co-written paper with a view to having the paper finished on Friday. Suppose you see me on the way to the office on Wednesday. You might exhort me to start work on the paper as soon as I get to the office. Right? I am appropriately exhortable. Suppose I get distracted and I just don't do it. And you find out about this later on. Okay. Does it follow that it's appropriate to blame me? It seems to me that the answer to that is not so fast. Yeah. So, yeah, maybe I should have started on this on Wednesday, first thing, but I make up the time later on. Maybe I managed to complete my version of the draft on Thursday ahead of time. Maybe I'm a sensitive soul, suffering so badly from writer's block that even the smallest amount of criticism will lead me into a spiraling crisis of confidence. All of these things, it seems to me, would make it inappropriate to blame me on Thursday evening, even though it was appropriate to exhort me on Wednesday morning. So if that's right, then yeah, HB is false. But if HB is false and H is true, how do we get out of the problem? Seems to me the way to get out of the problem is to reject the natural view. If one rejects the natural view, then it seems to me the objection to my view about the difference between accountability and blamability also won't work. Okay, there we are. We're all done.
Thank you. Now,
shall I
the commentator. Sorry, Bill?
It's okay. I'm just stopping the share so that I can see people.
All right. Now the commentator for Bill's talk. Just a minute. He is Ruhullah Hakşenas, and he's a graduate student here at Bilkent Department of Philosophy.
Yeah, thanks, Bill, for the talk, and thanks, Tufan, for your efforts for making this conference possible. Bill has given me a lot of comments in the last words, and as I can't give him a good comment, I try my best to give a comment silly enough to make him laugh, and it is the best thing I think I can do. I understand your view in maybe somehow different terms. I understand the view that first you ascribe to Petit, Cope, and Chant as a view that thinks that holding an entity responsible comes first to being that entity responsible. For short, we may call it blame first view or holding responsible first view. And I have some problem with this view. And maybe if these problems are worth thinking, maybe it will worth thinking also about your view that can be called holding entity obligation bearer first view. That is the idea that holding an entity obligation bearer is a prior question to whether the entity is obligation bearer. So if this is the general idea that I'm trying to talk about. And so I start by suggesting that a minor point that maybe show that holding responsible first view is better than blame first view. The idea is that we can be responsible for morally neutral things. And it is obvious that for those things, there is no blame. So blame cannot come first. The other reason for this minor point is that blame, maybe it is hard to conceive it without responsibility. So even before arguing for a philosophical theory, it is hard to say what is blame without responsibility. Suppose that you hit your toe to the table legs, and you blame the table at that time. Later, when you look back to this occasion, you think that, oh, I was very crazy to blame table. Table is not responsible. So it is hard to conceive blame in a way that don't presuppose responsibility. So maybe holding responsible first view is a better view because of these two reasons. So let's talk about holding responsible first view. There is two reading of this view. First of all, I think the best example of this view is Peter Strauss's view. And one common objection to Peter Strauss's view is that suppose a community who all the members of the community hold some people responsible, that it is very obvious that they should not hold them responsible. So it is a very bad idea to say that that community is right because all the members agree on how to hold people responsible. So a response to this criticism is that Strauss's view is not a very descriptive view. And it is in your paper, you are talking always about when it is appropriate to blame a person. So this normative reading of Strauss's view is a more charitable reading. But the problem is that when you replace a descriptive sense of holding responsible with a normative sense of holding responsible, that is the idea that when we should hold a person or an entity responsible, it is hard to say, okay, how it can be a holding responsible first view. What the difference between, is it not the case that the reasons we have to hold an entity responsible is dependent or equal to the reasons that an entity is responsible? So the only way that can come to my mind that leaves this strategy both conceivable and both not trivial is that the way that Strauss himself talks in his paper and the strategy Scanlon has in Theory of Blame and many compatibilists, that they think that it is not the case about the all reasons for whether a person or an entity is responsible or not. It is just about the external reasons to the practices of holding responsible. So the idea will be that the reasons internal to holding a person responsible is the same with the reasons, or at least yeah, I think it's the same with the reasons that the entity is responsible. So this is the general idea. So my claim or my worry that I put it in a way of claim is that if it is the only good reading of holding responsible first view, then any argument that appeal to the reasons for blame before the reasons for holding, for the idea that an entity is responsible is either hopeless or trivial, other than this reading. And now I want to go to my second part of comment that is very close to this part. And in this part, I try to suggest that maybe we should read Petit at least different from you. And if I have time, I can talk about chant and cop as well. The idea is that Petit's argument is not a holding responsible first view in the view that you suggest, that, or in another way, I don't think that Petit's arguments for why groups can be responsible are based on the 3 steps argument you read Petit. Yeah, Petit has an argument very close to the 3 steps argument, but I think, and it is how I read Petit, that this is his reason for why it is practically important to think about his real reason, real argument for why groups are responsible. And his argument, as you put it in a footnote, and if my worry is right, it says that maybe it deserves more than footnote, is that he argues that, as you know, that groups in some circumstances can be autonomous agents, can have their judgments besides the judgments of every individual, and can have they control over their actions based on that judgment, again, in a sense beyond than the control of every individual. So this is, I think, his reasons for why groups are responsible agents. Just to motivate you that my reading of Petit is how it is different from you. Suppose that, suppose a word that there are groups that satisfies all the 3 conditions Petit says, the autonomous agency, the group judgment, and the group control. But for some reasons, all these agential groups never do any actions that is not morally neutral. Yeah, they are always do morally neutral. It is not the case that they can't. It just, they don't. And suppose that you have a kind of divine foreknowledge that they never do. They never do any action that is not morally neutral. I think if in that word you ask Petit that, do you think still your argument works for the groups are morally responsible? I think he says, yeah, it is still a true statement about the word. And if you care to have a true propositions about the word, you should put the propositions that some groups are morally responsible in the set of true propositions, even it is not practically important ever, because no group agent ever do anything that is not morally neutral. So I think that his argument, is just to motivate that in our actual world, there are many occasions that group agents do morally non-neutral things. And so we have practical reasons to take his argument seriously. And if his argument is right, then blame the group agent. So I conclude that I think I don't have time for talking about chant and cop. So my understanding is that to conclude, I think the relationship between being responsible, that is very close to your idea of backward-reaching responsibility, and the idea of holding responsible, that is very close to your idea of forward-looking responsibility, is maybe much harder than you treat in your paper. And there is a huge literature, as you know, about the relationship between being responsible and holding responsible. And yeah, just this. I hope I have made you laugh enough.
Okay, so I got three things to say that I think I can be quite quick about. And I don't, it might not cover everything that Rue's mentioned. So thanks very much. You've given me a lot to think about there. First of all, about Pettit. So look, I mean, in the paper, I sort of go into the sort of text in a little bit more detail. And I do say, look, there are obviously things in Pettit's text that suggest that he doesn't fully endorse the three-step argument. And one of them is that he says, look, you know, if you don't have a collective agent, then it's inappropriate to hold, you know, a non-agential group responsible. And that's why it's really important to have corporate agents, right? So he does seem to think that, you know, in that case, the responsibility can go away, right? So, yeah, so in terms of, you know, the charitable interpretation of Pettit, yeah, fair enough. What I tried to do was say, well, look, here is an instance of what looks like an argument of the three-step form. And certainly I've been susceptible to this form of argument in the past. And I, you know, and I think it just won't work, right? Okay. Sometime we should talk about cop and chant, because it seems to me that in those cases, it really does seem much harder to sort of exculpate them, particularly chant. Secondly, on the sort of blame first picture. So look, I don't necessarily want to accept what you might call a projectivist picture of backward-looking responsibility. That's to say, I don't want to say that the facts about appropriate blamability are somehow metaphysically or ontologically prior to the facts about backward-looking obligation. That might be true, but I don't want to commit myself to it. I think that all I need is the idea that the facts about blame and the facts about appropriate blame and the facts about backward-looking responsibility track one another. Yeah, okay. But you know, you could think either that the facts about blamability are prior or the facts about moral responsibility are prior. Okay, I'm actually inclined to think the facts about moral responsibility are prior to the facts about blamability. Okay. It doesn't matter. What matters for the argument is that they should match up with one another. Right. Now, finally, you had a thing about, well, look, there's this word appropriate, and it's normative. And there's a worry that you're going to get something circular here. Because if you talk about appropriate blamability, it looks as though what you might be saying is, these are the people that you ought to blame. And now that looks as though that might be an obligation involving term. Yeah? Yeah. I think, or if you talk about what the practices are, it might look as though these are the practices that you ought to adopt, right? Okay, I think what I want to do is rely on a distinction between deontic normativity and teleological normativity, right? Okay, so what I want to say about the blaming practice and the accountability practice is, you know, you assess those not in terms of whether they're the practices that we ought to hold. You assess that in terms of whether they're the best practices for us to have. And that's, you know, a different kind of normative. It's a different, it does involve normative notions, but it involves a different set of normative notions. And then I say, so appropriately blamed is going to be construed as, you know, is blamed in accordance with the best teleologically set of blaming practices. So on the view about whether the notion I want is blame or something that enables you to be responsible for good things as well as bad things. Yeah, I think there are different notions of responsibility in play here. Yeah. And you know, what I want is the notion of responsibility that people use when they use it as a synonym for something like obligation. Yeah. And so, yeah, for that reason, you know, I'm not idea that you can be responsible for things that you have done and that you were supposed to do, right? Okay. Yeah, I think that just seems like a verbal worry. Okay. So no doubt you'll want to come back to me on all of these, but let's do that another time. Thanks for the comments, and I hope there's time for other people as well.
All right. Bill, would you like to run the Q&A session for us, or should I do that?
Could you do it? Because I've just dropped my glasses and I can't see the screen very clearly.
Okay, all right, sure, all right. Murali?
Hi, thanks, Bill. Just two questions about your three-step argument. They both involve step number one.
Yeah.
I think you cheated slightly in your description of the first step, as it were, because the first step, as you've written it, is where it seemed intuitively plausible that some or a group of individuals are responsible. So it isn't just a quantum of blame, full stop. It's a quantum of blame which is attributable to the group, plausibly attributable to the group. So I think your Harold Starr example doesn't really apply. If it was an act of God, then you're not going to hold the group even partly responsible. It's not plausible to do so. So I think a lot hangs on whether how you spell out that quantum of blame, whether it's just blame full stop or whatever. But the second thing that occurred to me was maybe you could construct a three-step argument in terms of the idea of quantum of restitution or redress. And then that would explain both examples in a way. So, you know, it's something horrendous. These people have been majorly disadvantaged. They're traumatized for life. So if it turns out that nobody was to blame as far as the ship was concerned, then the government is responsible for restitution. So it handles the Harold Starr case, I think, quite nicely. It does rely on two notions of responsibility, which I think you were heading towards recognizing, but I think glossed over in the talk. There's an idea of somebody being morally responsible because they're culpable, and somebody being morally responsible because they're ultimately responsible for your welfare. And if there's nobody else who's going to cough up, they have to cough up. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. So a quick thought might be, I mean, maybe the right way to sort of put the three-step argument is there's a bad outcome in which some individuals are implicated. Yeah. Okay. And it seems to me, you know, that is something that's true in all. Is that
true in Harold Starr?
Yeah.
My intuition is that it's not.
I mean, they might. I mean, so I'm obviously not going to say they're responsible, right? Okay. But they're involved, right?
Sorry to keep on going, but only to the extent that the people who work on the Thames, work on the river, are also involved.
Right.
I mean, the notion of involved is just too vague.
Well, I mean, so one substantive thing I would say is, look, there does seem to be a morally significant sense of sort of, there at least seems to be a morally significant sense of involvement that doesn't have to imply culpability. So think about think of some of the examples that Bernard Williams uses when he's talking about agent regret. Yeah, okay.
You're frozen. So
yeah. Okay, can you hear me now?
I can do, yeah.
Yeah. So you know, it might.
We have to talk about this later, because I still disagree that even on that notion of moral responsibility, that the ship's crew are implicated.
So I suppose what I want to say is, look, if people on the ship's crew, you know, were traumatized, you know, you wouldn't want to say to them, look, this had nothing to do with you, right?
I disagree, but okay. I don't share that intuition. In the Herald Star case, it strikes me that none of them are implicated or responsible. But let's stop there. Sorry, thanks.
There was another thing that you said, and quantum of redress. I mean, I suppose what I think about that is, look, yeah, there are lots of cases where we do want to say it falls on somebody to redress in this case. But it does also seem to me that, you know, you might come to the conclusion that, yeah, look, we should have practices that redress people in these kinds of cases, but sometimes even that is going to be impracticable. So, you know, imagine that you have the disaster happening not in the UK, but a sort of less wealthy state, a state with fewer resources. You know, so people sometimes make this point about healthcare rights. They say, well, you know, it's all very well to say that people in the UK have a right to a fully functioning health service and they can expect that of their government. It's less clear that you can sort of expect that of a government in a situation where, you know, the most they can devote to any particular person's needs is, on average, is $100 a day. Right? Okay, doesn't really seem to make much sense to say the state should redress it.
Well, thanks.
But also now you seem to be moving in the direction, I think, of a quantum of accountability, right? Now you don't seem to be looking at backwards looking obligation. Now you do seem to be the thing that I think is talking about the thing that I think is different.
I will control myself and keep quiet. Thank you. We should talk about this further.
Okay.
Professor Ludwig?
Thanks, Bill, for the talk. I haven't been thinking of the arguments for group level backward looking moral responsibility as involving a quantum of blame that has to be distributed, but rather in terms of kind of an argument that does piggyback on a connection between forward looking and backwards looking moral responsibility, but maybe a principle that is a little more nuanced than the one that you identify. So as I've been thinking of it, roughly it goes as follows. Well, here's a group that has a duty to discharge. They're able to discharge it. They fail to discharge it. The group doesn't have an excuse, but each member of the group does. So the group is to blame for any harm that results as a result of their failure to fulfill their duty. But none of the members can be blamed, at least fully, because they have excuses that either let them off or at least ameliorate the blame that can be attached to them. Now, that's obviously something that looks first at the forward-looking duty to not discharge the duty in a way that doesn't result in harm, and then looks back after the fact to their being blamable for the harm if there aren't excusing factors. So that doesn't actually involve the idea of a quantum of blame at all, but it does leverage the idea that forward-looking responsibilities that you fail to fulfill without having any excuse that result in harm lead to blame. But it does seem to me that looking at your principle in V, you don't have anything about excuses. So it seems to me it does need to be fixed up, at least in that way, because I might have a forward-looking responsibility to do something, and then I die and I fail I'm not to blame for not fulfilling my duty in that case, or, someone hits me over the head, or I get distracted. Lots of things could happen. So I think we need, a little clause in there about, and there's nothing that excuses me from failing to fulfill my duty. Now, I think just to add a little bit to that, the argument against NV requires accepting H, but H doesn't really look to me to be in general correct for reasons that are connected with the example you give in co-author. There might be circumstances in which someone does have a duty, but exhorting them to do the duty might be counterproductive or might have other harms. So it can't be some, sort of blanket principle that connects those two things. I think also H and NV appropriately modified don't entail HB because of the distinction between it being appropriate to blame someone in the sense of a public act of blaming and someone's being to blame for something. And then finally, the example you give is one in which there's a harmless failure to fulfill a duty. So it's not really the same kind of thing as failure to fulfill a duty that results in a harm.
Right. Okay. Lots of stuff there. Let's see if I can remember all of it. So first of all, look, what I want to argue, one of the things I want to argue is considerations about forward-looking duties are prior to considerations about backward-looking cases. Okay. So, if you start from the position that these arguments all presuppose that there are forward-looking collective duties, you've given me everything that I want, right? Okay. One of the claims that I wanted to defend was you need to start from the forward-looking rather than the backward-looking, right? So, if you say, no, we're presupposing that these three people have a duty to prevent the person from dying of thirst. Well, I mean, first of all, that's great. That's all I that's all I really wanted. But secondly, right, it doesn't seem to me that can be a charitable interpretation of what's been going on in these cases, because surely that's not going to persuade anybody at all of the existence of duties falling on collective agents if they didn't already believe that, right? Okay. If it's a premise of Cox's argument that there's a forward-looking duty falling on the collective agent, yeah, then who's that supposed to prove? Who's that supposed to persuade? It's not going to persuade anybody that is skeptical about the existence of.
Could I interject just slightly there? So, Kopp is trying to argue that there are group level responsibilities not reducible to individual responsibility, group level, attributions of blame that can't be reduced to individual blame. And so for that purpose, he needed to show that the group level attributions are autonomous from the individual level attributions. It's perfectly okay to accept sentences of the form, they have a responsibility to do such and such. But the analysis of that is completely open at this point, and it might be analyzed in such a way that it just cashes out in terms of obligations of individuals to contribute in a certain way to group action. So that bit of the argument in which you say the group has no excuse, but the individuals do, and yet it's also the case that the group had a duty that they failed to fulfill, that's supposed to get you to the autonomy thesis. So the argument is doing some work there.
Okay. I have to say, I still think it's the case that it's not going to persuade a lot of people that it's targeted at if we start from a premise that there is a forward-looking obligation falling on the group. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't persuade me, but I think it's valid, but it's just unsound. That's my complaint with it.
Right. Well, my thought is, it's going to be unpersuasive, precisely because anybody that was in doubt about the conclusion would just kind of dispute the premise. Now, I did have something else. So I had at least one point to make about the stuff you said about NV. Let me see if I can. Yeah. So it's about HB. No, it's about H. And you said, well, yeah, there might be cases where sort of H fails because exhorting somebody is going to have precisely the wrong kind of effect on them. Yeah. So I suppose, one thing I want to say is, my claim about H is not that we should accept it, but that if you think there's a connection between blame and backward-looking responsibility, then you should accept this claim about the relationship between exhortation and forward-looking responsibility. Okay, and it seems to me that whatever kinds of bells and whistles you put into refining the connection between blame and backward-looking responsibility, you'll put the same bells and whistles into the claim about exhortation and forward-looking responsibility. And what was the second thing I wanted to say? Yeah, so yeah, suppose you say, okay, well, look, I'm just going to have to reject H. Then I think what I want to say is, well, then you're going to reject a close connection between blame and backward-looking responsibility. And then I think that NV is just not going to present a problem to me, because I think that NV only presents a problem provided you accept a claim about the relationship between backward-looking responsibility and blameability. Does that work?
Just I think you're thinking that exhortation is connected with appropriateness of blame, but if that's appropriateness of blame as explicitly blaming someone, then I have the same objection. And so I'm not going to go from is to blame to appropriate to blame. If it were appropriate to blame, it might be appropriate to exhort, but both those things I think are wrong.
Right, okay, but in that case, it seems to me that it seems to me that the natural view on its own is not what presents a problem for me. What presents a problem for me is precisely is a connection between NV and the connection between blame and backward-looking responsibility that you say you're going to reject. So in that case, it seems to me what you're saying is this objection that you think you're addressing is not an objection that I have reason to take seriously.
Or later.
Which yeah. Yeah, if that's right, great.
All right, we are out of time, a lot actually. So thank you, Bill,